This is the story of how Germany trusted the Enigma machine completely, how Britain came to read nearly everything Germany transmitted using it, and how the actual origin of that achievement remained genuinely obscured for decades after the war itself had already ended, hidden behind both official secrecy and later a considerably simpler story that proved easier to tell on screen. Every week we take apart a moment when a war turned, the people who made it happen, and the razor-thin margin between disaster and victory. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. German military planners trusted Enigma's own security almost without reservation, a confidence built on the machine's genuinely staggering mathematical complexity, its rotating wired rotors capable of producing an astronomical number of possible letter substitutions that change with every single keystroke a German operator actually typed into the device. The machine itself had originally been developed for commercial use, protecting business communication from industrial espionage, before German military planners recognized its own potential and adapted it specifically for encrypted military traffic, adding additional rotors and increasingly complex daily settings that German cryptographic experts genuinely believed made the resulting cipher mathematically impossible to break within any time frame that would actually matter operationally. That confidence proved badly misplaced years before the war itself even began, a miscalculation German commanders will continue making in one form or another for the entire remaining length of the conflict that followed. Poland's own cipher bureau, recruiting mathematicians rather than the linguists and classicists most nations still relied on for cryptography at the time, recognized considerably earlier than any other intelligence service in Europe that a purely mechanical cipher demanded a genuinely mathematical solution rather than the traditional linguistic pattern analysis codebreakers had relied on for centuries beforehand. The Bureau assigned the specific problem to a young mathematician named Marian Rejewski, working alongside colleagues Henryk Zygalski and Jerzy Różycki. 3 men recruited directly from Polish universities specifically for their own mathematical training rather than any prior intelligence experience of any kind. The Polish team actually broke Enigma's underlying mathematical structure as early as the final days of 1932, working largely in isolation with limited resources, and no guarantee their own government would even continue funding the project once initial results proved genuinely difficult to translate into practical, ongoing intelligence. A full 7 years before Britain's own code-breaking effort at Bletchley Park had even properly begun in earnest under considerably more generous wartime funding and staffing. Poland's own achievement remained a closely guarded secret for years, shared with nobody outside a small circle of Polish military intelligence, until the country's own precarious geographic position between Germany and the Soviet Union made that secrecy considerably less valuable than the alliance it might instead help secure once war with Germany began looking genuinely inevitable, rather than merely possible. On July the 25th, 1939, with barely 6 weeks remaining before Germany's own invasion of Poland would actually begin, Polish intelligence chief Guido Langer invited British and French intelligence officials to a secret meeting at a cryptology centre outside Warsaw and revealed everything. The mathematical methods Rejewski's own team had developed over nearly a decade of continuous work, working reconstructions of the Enigma machine itself, built entirely from theoretical deduction, rather than any captured physical example. And even the Poles' own early mechanical code-breaking device, a forerunner to the machine Alan Turing, would soon build considerably further upon once the war had actually begun in earnest. British and French officials attending that meeting reportedly left genuinely stunned by the sheer scope of what Polish cryptologists had already quietly achieved, an intelligence gift considerably more valuable, in practical terms, than anything either Allied nations' own code-breaking efforts had managed to produce on their own, up to that exact point. Before we get into what Britain actually did with that Polish foundation once the war forced everyone's hand, if you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. Alan Turing arrived at Britain's own government code and cipher school at Bletchley Park on September the 4th, 1939, just 3 days after Germany's invasion of Poland had actually begun, inheriting the Polish team's own considerable head start rather than starting the entire code-breaking problem from nothing the way popular retellings have often suggested since a certain film reshaped public understanding of the entire episode decades later. Turing, working alongside fellow mathematician Gordon Welchman, developed a considerably more powerful electromechanical device the British called the Bombe, a direct conceptual descendant of the Polish Marian Rejewski's own team had already built years earlier, scaled up and refined specifically to handle the additional security measures Germany had introduced to Enigma, once the war itself had actually begun, and German operators started changing their own cipher settings daily, rather than the less frequent schedule the pre-war Polish success had originally been built around defeating. Bletchley Park's own staff grew from an initial group of roughly 30 code breakers, linguists, and mathematicians in 1938 to more than 500 employees within a single year of the war actually beginning, and eventually to several thousand personnel by the war's final years. An operation that expanded from a modest pre-war cipher school into one of the largest and most consequential intelligence operations in the entire history of the conflict. The resulting intelligence, codenamed Ultra, gave British commanders access to a genuinely staggering volume of German military communications for the remainder of the entire war, from operational orders and troop movements to, most consequentially of all, during the brutal Battle of the Atlantic, the precise locations German U-boats were transmitting back to their own command as they hunted the convoys keeping Britain supplied and fed with food, fuel and war material shipped from across the Atlantic. Royal Navy Wrens, members of the Women's Royal Naval Service, operated the noisy, physically demanding bombing machines around the clock in shifts, a workforce whose own considerable contribution to the code-breaking effort has, like the Polish mathematician who came before them, often received less popular recognition than the small number of individually celebrated figures whose names actually survived into post-war public memory. Historian Harry Hinsley, who had personally worked at Bletchley Park during the war and later co-authored the official history of British wartime intelligence, estimated that ultra-intelligence shortened the war in Europe by as much as 2 years. Other historians studying the same evidence since have suggested the true figure may have run even longer, a difference measured not in some abstract historical footnote, but in millions of additional lives the war's own earlier conclusion likely spared on every side of the conflict, regardless of which specific nation any individual life actually belonged to. The Enigma machine's own physical design reflected a deceptively simple-looking device, concealing genuinely formidable mathematical complexity underneath its own compact wooden case. Resembling an ordinary typewriter at first glance, the machine used a series of rotating wired rotors, typically 3 or 4, depending on the specific military variant, combined with a plug board that let an operator further scramble the electrical connections between letters before a message was ever actually transmitted. Each keystroke advanced the rotors in a specific mechanical sequence, meaning the same letter typed twice in immediate succession would almost never produce the same encrypted output twice. A design feature that defeated the kind of simple frequency analysis code breakers had relied on for centuries against considerably simpler substitution ciphers. German operators changed the machine's own rotor order, starting positions, and plug board connections according to a fixed daily schedule, distributed in advance through secure codebooks, meaning Bletchley Park's own codebreakers effectively had to solve an entirely new mathematical puzzle every single day the war continued. A relentless, repeating challenge that never actually ended for the codebreakers even once the underlying mathematical approach to solving it had already been thoroughly worked out years earlier by Rejewski's own original Polish team. Ultra-intelligence also played a quieter but genuinely significant role in confirming, from the German side itself, exactly how well the wider Allied deception effort ahead of the Normandy invasion was actually working. A connection this channel has already touched on from the perspective of the German commanders that same deception successfully misled. Bletchley Park's own decrypts let Allied planners read German assessments of where the invasion was actually expected, confirming in near real time that Operation Fortitude's fictional army group had genuinely convinced German High Command Normandy might still be a diversion rather than the main invasion. Intelligence that gave Eisenhower and his own senior commanders a level of confidence in their own deception plan's effectiveness that no amount of purely defensive planning alone could ever have provided with the same certainty. That specific use of ultra, confirming an enemy's own state of confusion rather than simply revealing troop movements or supply schedules directly, illustrates just how broadly the code-breaking effort's own practical value actually extended across the war's final years, well beyond the more straightforward tactical applications. Most popular accounts of the program tend to focus on most heavily. The practical impact of ultra-intelligence became especially concrete during the North African campaign, a theatre this channel has already covered from Rommel's own perspective as his supply convoys crossed the Mediterranean toward Axis forces fighting there. Ultra-decrypts frequently gave Allied commanders advanced knowledge of exactly when and where Axis fuel and supply shipments were scheduled to cross from Italy. Intelligence that let British aircraft and submarines target those specific convoys with a precision no amount of ordinary aerial reconnaissance alone could ever have realistically achieved on its own. That targeted interdiction campaign, built directly on decoded Enigma traffic, played a genuinely significant role in strangling Rommel's own supply lines across the length of the North African campaign. A direct, measurable battlefield consequence of the same code-breaking achievement that had begun years earlier in a Polish mathematics department working with nothing more than intercepted radio traffic and considerable theoretical ingenuity. Germany never seriously suspected its own supposedly unbreakable cipher had actually been broken almost from the war's earliest weeks. A security failure Bletchley Park's own operators worked obsessively to preserve for the entire remaining length of the conflict, rather than allowing a single careless operational decision to expose an intelligence advantage that had already taken years to build. British commanders receiving ultra-intelligence had to weigh, in case after case, whether acting directly on decoded information might itself reveal to German intelligence that their own supposedly secure cipher had actually been compromised, sometimes deliberately delaying a response, allowing reconnaissance aircraft to independently spot a target Ultra had already identified, so a subsequent attack could be plausibly attributed to conventional aerial observation instead, or manufacturing an alternative plausible explanation for how the British had actually obtained a specific piece of intelligence rather than simply acting on it immediately and risking exposure of the entire program built on that same fragile secrecy. That obsessive operational discipline extended to Winston Churchill himself, who received ultra-decrypts personally, but understood as clearly as any officer working directly at Bletchley Park that the intelligence's own value depended entirely on Germany never learning it existed, a strategic patience that required tolerating real, foreseeable losses in specific individual situations rather than risk compromising an advantage whose full value would only be realized across the entire remaining length of the war. That obsessive operational discipline meant the secret survived not just the war itself, but decades afterward. The full scope of Ultra's own wartime achievement remaining formally classified until 1974, when former intelligence officer Frederick Winterbotham finally received official permission to publish an account revealing the program's existence publicly for the first time, more than 3 decades after the war itself had actually ended, and long after most of the operation's own original participants had already died without ever being able to publicly discuss their own wartime contribution. German confidence in Enigma's own security persisted right through several specific moments across the war where a more skeptical mind might reasonably have questioned it. A stubborn institutional overconfidence that historians studying the conflict since have generally attributed to the machine's own genuine mathematical sophistication, rather than any specific evidence Germany actually possessed, suggesting its security remained intact. German naval commanders, tracking suspiciously effective Allied convoy routing decisions and suspiciously well-timed U-boat losses throughout the Battle of the Atlantic specifically, occasionally raised internal concerns about whether Enigma might somehow have been compromised. Concerns senior German cryptographic officials repeatedly investigated and repeatedly dismissed, attributing Allied success instead to radar, aerial reconnaissance, or simple coincidence, rather than ever seriously entertaining the possibility that their own supposedly unbreakable cipher machine had actually failed them. That repeated pattern of investigation and dismissal meant German commanders spent years explaining away evidence that, examined honestly and without the underlying assumption of Enigma's own invulnerability, might have led to a genuine security review considerably earlier than the war's actual conclusion ultimately allowed for. This is not a story about a single brilliant mind defeating an entire nation's cryptographic confidence through pure individual genius alone, a version of events popular film has told so effectively that the Polish mathematicians who actually broke Enigma's underlying mathematics years earlier were, for decades, reduced in the wider popular imagination to little more than a footnote in somebody else's story, if they were mentioned at all in the versions of the story most casual audiences actually encountered. It is a story about a secret 3 separate nations built together, France's own early intelligence contributions, gathering critical documents and technical details in the years before the war actually began. Poland's own foundational mathematical breakthrough, achieved years before anyone else had even seriously attempted the problem with the same mathematical rigour, and Britain's own subsequent scaling of that breakthrough into a sustained, war-spanning intelligence operation that had to be protected as jealously as it had been built in the first place. Alan Turing's own post-war life added a further, genuinely tragic layer to a story already complicated by decades of obscured credit and delayed recognition for nearly everyone actually involved in the achievement. Despite his own genuinely significant contribution to the code-breaking effort, Turing was prosecuted by British authorities in 1952 for homosexual acts, then still illegal under British law, and accepted chemical castration as an alternative to imprisonment, a punishment inflicted on a man whose own wartime work had been formally classified, and therefore could not even be publicly cited in his own defence or in mitigation of the charges against him. Turing died in 1954, in circumstances an inquest at the time ruled suicide, just 2 years after that prosecution and 2 decades before Winterbotham's own book would finally reveal to the British public exactly what Turing's own wartime work had actually achieved for the country that had, in the meantime, prosecuted him so harshly for an entirely unrelated matter. Britain issued Turing a formal royal pardon in 2013, and the country's own government communications headquarters, the direct institutional descendant of the wartime Bletchley Park operation Turing had once worked at, later apologised specifically for how he had been treated, a reckoning that arrived nearly 60 years after his own death, and considerably too late to matter to the man it was actually meant to honour. Marian Rejewski himself lived through Poland's own post-war communist era, largely uncelebrated for an achievement that had genuinely helped shorten a world war, his own contribution overshadowed for decades by a British-led narrative that rarely mentioned Poland's own foundational role at all, until relatively recent historical scholarship finally began correcting the record more fully in the decades following the war's own conclusion. Rejewski worked for years afterward in relative obscurity, his own wartime accomplishment unknown, even to many of his own neighbours and colleagues, given the same official secrecy that had protected Ultra's own broader wartime value, a personal cost few of the popular retellings of the Enigma story have ever fully reckoned with in the decades since his own death. A plaque at Bletchley Park today, added considerably later than the museum's own original exhibits, formally credits Rejewski, Różycki and Zygalski by name for work the plaque itself describes as having greatly assisted the codebreakers who followed them, an overdue acknowledgement of a debt Britain's own wartime secrecy had, for entirely understandable operational reasons at the time, never been able to properly credit while the war itself was actually being fought, and the entire programme's own existence remained a closely guarded secret from friend and enemy alike. The broader Ultra programme's own value extended considerably beyond Enigma itself as the war continued, eventually encompassing German efforts to break an even more sophisticated cipher machine, the Lorenz, used specifically for communications between Hitler's own high command and senior field commanders across every major theatre of the war, traffic considerably more strategically valuable, in many cases, than the tactical Enigma communications the codebreakers had already grown accustomed to intercepting. British code breakers, again building on techniques and insights first developed cracking Enigma, eventually built an early electronic computer called Colossus, specifically to attack this more advanced cipher, a machine some historians now consider among the earliest genuine programmable electronic computers ever constructed anywhere in the world, designed and built by engineer Tommy Flowers, largely on his own initiative, after more senior officials had initially expressed skepticism that an electronic rather than purely electromechanical solution could actually work reliably enough to trust with genuinely critical wartime intelligence. Colossus itself remained classified for even longer than the broader Enigma story, its own existence not publicly acknowledged until the 1970s, alongside the wider revelation about Bletchley Park's own operations, meaning one of the actual technological ancestors of the modern computer sat completely unknown to the public, and largely unknown even within the computing industry itself, for decades after engineers elsewhere had already begun independently rediscovering many of the same basic principles Flowers and his own team had already worked out under wartime secrecy years earlier. A genuinely strange historical footnote in which Britain's own claim to an early foundational computing achievement remained entirely invisible for the better part of 3 decades. The full accounting of exactly who deserves credit for breaking Enigma has continued evolving even in relatively recent years, as previously classified documents have been released, and historians in multiple countries have worked to reconstruct a considerably more complete and considerably more internationally distributed picture than either wartime secrecy or post-war national pride originally allowed for. Dermot Turing, Alan Turing's own nephew, published a book specifically aimed at correcting what he considered an overly simplified popular narrative, one that had, in his own assessment, elevated his uncle into something close to a solitary genius myth at the expense of the considerably larger cast of Polish, French and British contributors, whose own combined work had actually made the entire achievement possible in the first place. That corrective effort reflects a broader pattern historians have noted across many celebrated wartime achievements, where the specific individual whose name survives most prominently in popular memory is rarely the same person, or the same small group of people whose actual documented contribution was most decisive to the underlying outcome. A pattern this channel has already encountered examining several other celebrated wartime stories, whose own popular version similarly simplified a considerably more distributed, more genuinely collaborative achievement into a single memorable name or a single dramatic moment audiences could actually hold on to without needing to track a dozen separate contributors across 3 different countries. If you want more stories about the achievement's history initially credited to the wrong person, subscribe, and we will keep finding them for you. See you in the next one.